She said yes before he even finished the sentence. I watched my wife's face, not shocked, not disgusted, not looking at me for help. Just that small, almost relieved nod, like she'd been waiting for someone to finally ask. That was the moment something inside me didn't break. It just stopped, like a clock that had been running slightly wrong for years and finally quit altogether. My name is Adrian. I'm 38 years old. I manage logistics for a mid-sized import company, or I did anyway. I'm not the guy who raises his voice at family dinners. I'm not the one who makes scenes or sends threatening texts at 2 in the morning. People have described me as steady, reliable. My mother-in-law once called me the boring one at Christmas, and the whole table laughed, including my wife, Simone. I smiled too, because that's what I did. I kept the peace. I kept my mouth shut. I kept everything running quietly in the background while other people got the credit. My boss, Raymond, had been chipping away at me for almost 4 years. Not loudly, that's not how men like him operate. It was always subtle, a promotion I was passed over for with a vague explanation about optics, a client account I'd built from scratch, handed to a newer hire without so much as a conversation. Little things, a joke at a meeting about my presentation style that got a laugh at my expense, the way he'd call me buddy in front of clients like I was an intern. I told myself it was just how business worked. I told myself I was being too sensitive. I had started to wonder about Simone and Raymond about 6 months before the party. She'd come home late twice in 1 week, both times with a story that had the rhythm of something rehearsed. I didn't push it. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd find. Maybe I just didn't have the energy for a fight on top of everything else. You tell yourself a lot of comfortable lies when the truth is sitting right in front of you wearing your wife's perfume. The staff party was a year-end thing, held at a venue Raymond had rented out. Open bar, catered food, the whole performance. Simone had been excited about it in a way that should have told me something. She spent longer than usual getting ready. She laughed at things that evening in a way she hadn't laughed with me in a long time. We were 20 minutes in when Raymond found me near the bar. He put his hand on my shoulder, that grip men like him use when they want to remind you of the power dynamic without actually saying it, and leaned in close, low enough to nobody around us could hear clearly. "I'm taking a few days at my lake property," he said, "and I'd like Simone to come along. You're going to be fine with that. And if you're not fine with that, you're going to have a hard time finding a reason to show up Monday." I looked at him. He was smiling, the kind of smile that lives on the face of someone who has never once been told no and actually meant it. I didn't answer him. I turned around, found Simone across the room, and walked over to her. I pulled her aside, gently, calmly, and I told her exactly what he'd just said to me, word for word. I looked her in the eyes, and I waited. She looked down at her drink. Then she said, "Adrian, it's not a big deal. It's just a few days. You're always working anyway." There it was. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I set my glass down on a nearby table with the kind of care you use when you're concentrating very hard on not falling apart, and I walked out of that venue into the cold air. I sat in my car for about 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes, something shifted. Not rage. Rage is loud and stupid, and it burns itself out. This was quieter, colder. It was the feeling of finally seeing the whole picture clearly after years of staring at the corner of it. Here's what Raymond and Simone didn't know about me, what almost nobody at that company knew because I had never felt the need to talk about it. 3 years earlier, my uncle, my mother's older brother, a man who had built a small but successful chain of freight logistics companies, had passed away and left me a 31% stake in a holding company that had a controlling interest in 2 of Raymond's primary vendor contracts. Raymond's entire operation depended on those vendor relationships for about 40% of his annual throughput. I had never mentioned this to anyone at work. It had never come up. I had been managing my uncle's estate quietly through a separate attorney, and the vendor contracts had just continued to run as they always had.
Raymond had directed billing irregularities, a paper trail of client funds that had been allocated in ways that didn't match the invoices. I hadn't collected it with any plan in mind. I'd just always been the kind of person who keeps records because the world tends to need them eventually. I drove home. I went upstairs. I opened the gun safe in my closet, and I took out my grandfather's .44 Magnum, a revolver he'd carried for decades, kept in perfect condition, something I'd inherited along with a few other things when he passed. I cleaned it, checked it, and then I drove back to that party. The room did freeze when I walked back in, I'll tell you that honestly. A man walking into a party holding a large revolver at his side has a certain effect on a crowd. The music cut. Conversations stopped. Raymond turned and saw me from across the room, and I watched the color leave his face. I walked to the center of the room. I set the revolver down on a table, gently, deliberately, facing no one, and I said, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "I'm not here to hurt anybody. I'm here because I want witnesses." Then I called Raymond's name, and in front of 40-some-odd employees, vendors, and their partners, I told him exactly what I was. I told him about the holding company. I told him about the vendor contracts. I told him I had already emailed my attorney that evening with instructions to begin the process of reviewing the contract terms, which included a clause giving my share of the holding company the right to audit and suspend service agreements in cases of financial misconduct. I also had documentation. Over the past 2 years, I had quietly kept records, emails where I told him I had the emails. The room was absolutely silent. Raymond started to speak, and I held up one hand. I told him I wasn't interested in a conversation. I told him that by Monday morning, his vendors would receive formal notice of a pending audit. I told him his 2 largest clients, both of whom I had personally cultivated and whose principals I had maintained relationships with outside of Raymond's involvement, would be receiving calls from me over the weekend. Then I picked up my grandfather's revolver, put it back in my waistband, and I walked out. Within 48 hours, Raymond's home was on fire. His vendors paused the contracts pending review. One of his major clients called him directly to ask questions he couldn't answer. His CFO, a woman who had clearly been watching the billing situation with some nervousness of her own, reached out to my attorney independently. I didn't go back to that job. I didn't need to. Simone called me 6 times that weekend. I answered once, on the 3rd call, long enough to tell her that I had spoken with a divorce attorney and that she should do the same. She cried. She told me I was overreacting. I told her I wasn't reacting at all anymore. Then I hung up. Raymond resigned from his own company 4 months later ahead of a formal investigation. The restructuring that followed brought me into a consulting role that paid nearly twice what I'd been earning. The vendor contract stabilized. 2 of my former colleagues got the promotions they had been quietly promised for years and never received. I moved into a smaller apartment. I started sleeping better than I had in years. People keep asking me if I regret how I handled it. I don't. Not the part people think I should regret. I was never going to shoot anyone in that room, but I needed Raymond to feel for one honest moment the same helplessness he had spent 4 years manufacturing in me. I needed the room to see it happen. The quiet ones aren't weak. We're just patient. I didn't destroy Raymond's world. I just stopped protecting it from the weight of its own choices. If you enjoy stories about betrayal, revenge, and justice served cold, subscribe for more daily stories.